A 53-year-old Cheshire woman who posted on Facebook, "Don't protect the mosques, blow the mosques up with the adults in it," told a court she had no intention to put people in fear. She was jailed for 15 months. A 67-year-old Epping Forest man got swept up in a demonstration in Whitehall, confronted police in a fighting pose and chanted, "You're not English anymore," and "Who the fuck is Allah?" at them. He was jailed for 20 months. And a Mansfield man posted that great Englishmen who had committed arson should target a Nottinghamshire hotel, adding, "Anyone got the balls?" He claimed it was just an example of his dark humour. He was also jailed for 20 months. If there's a recurring theme in the riot verdicts, both for incitement and for actual violence, it's often that the perpetrators claimed they didn't know what they were doing, or that they would deny they'd caused any real harm. There is a sense of unreality about both the violence and the surrounding social media world, where incitement is somehow satire or free speech, or else somehow it doesn't cause any harm at all. How have we got here with the disconnection between actions and consequences? And is it all Elon Musk's fault? Seth, do you recognise this? Does this ring true to you, that the social world is now so different from the real world that people are shocked when they're judged by the old-fashioned standards of observable reality?
Yes. I mean, it's worth considering that the social world has always been artificial. And the idea that this very artificial construct should reflect reality, that is a point of view. And this is a point of view that's always been contested. There have always been sort of counter-arguments to that, and people saying, I quite like my artificial environment. You get that with the sort of idea of, say, holistic computer games where you have an entirely virtual life.
Yeah.
Now, that can be a lovely, harmless escape, or it can be something a little more sinister. I don't want to degenerate to these sort of sensationalist things of the 1990s where people are saying, you've been playing a Sega Mega Drive for an hour a day, therefore you're going to be a homicidal maniac. You know, these are sort of unnuanced conversations about it. But there is a conversation generally to be had about what is healthy and what is unhealthy and how we engage with different realities.
But it's not so much that the social world is unreal. We know that.
Yeah.
It's that people are treating the real world as if it's the social world, where you can stand in the street, shout, "Burn down that hotel," and then when you're arrested say, "Oh, it was satire," or "Oh, I didn't really mean it," or "I didn't think anybody would listen."
Yes, but that's, I think, something that you see much more widely, just as a consequence, for example, of our all having spent so much time on Zoom during large parts of the pandemic. You know, and we start to approach conversations as though, well, I didn't like you, and I've always actually had a strong dislike of you, and I never wanted to say anything, but now I'm just going to shout at you and then switch off the connection and flounce out. And you can't do that with a normal conversation.
Yeah, unfortunately. Yes, no, you can't do that with a normal conversation.
No.
Do you think that this kind of, quite a lot of people have been horribly shocked by the consequences of the things that they've said and done, and taken it as a personal affront as they're led off into the cells? Does this feed into this kind of idea that you can't say anything these days? The persecution myth. You never could call for arson and murder, offline or online. What does it mean that large chunks of the kind of right-wing opinion universe are saying, well, it's terrible that people are being held to account for this?
Yeah, well, the problem is that even though incitement to violence has always been something that has been at the very least shunned and more recently a crime, people would still do it. And there is a sort of defensiveness and a sort of invented tradition of, well, I've always felt entitled in the privacy of my own home. And that's part of the issue. It's that there is an erosion of the idea of privacy, because when you're meeting in those online forums, you're actually meeting in a shared communal space, and you're actually meeting very often in private space. It comes back to actually this thing about clubs. You're not meeting in a public square. You're meeting in a private establishment set by the rules of the people who own that establishment. Now, they might be lovely, community-minded people with a very strong commitment to truth, or they might be people who take a rather shady view of human nature and find that actually there's money to be made by encouraging clicks and money to be made by encouraging aggression.
Raf, when people talk about politics and social media, they usually talk about Twitter because Elon Musk is so conspicuous and because it's so putrid. But as many of us know from what our kind of older relatives post, Facebook has got steadily more extreme. Do we have a boomer media problem more than we have a kind of social media problem?
It's an interesting question. I think it's certainly true that we're only beginning to understand that all of the systems, all the digital systems through which we mediate social interaction, accelerate a process of radicalization. That means whatever view you have, or whatever opinion you hold, starting on something quite banal, can be rapidly accelerated to its most extreme iteration. And you see this in a way, there's countless examples of people in local neighborhoods, Facebook groups who maybe have an objection to a new phone mast going up, and before you know it, they're down the rabbit hole of QAnon and wild conspiracy theories. Again, anecdotally, and yeah, anecdote is never a tremendous way in which to construct any of these points, but anecdotally, yeah, a lot of that is actually older people. I think Seth's point about the pandemic is a very good one. There were just a lot of people who were stuck at home on their own, only communicating through their computer, but also just exploring and allowing the algorithm to lead them down YouTube and Facebook channels towards very peculiar ways of looking at the world.
You say anecdotes are not data, but when every single time a picture of an old phone box turns in 3 posts into Enoch Powell was right, you know something is going on, don't you? It kind of gravitates.
Well, there's something else interesting going on here, I think, which is that, I mean, going back to your earlier point about whether or not there's something new or weird about the number of people who think it's okay to say really extreme things, including just explicit racism or incitement to violence. I think part of this is actually an extension of something that's happened more widely in the intellectual and ideological sphere of right-wing politics, which is this compulsion to believe that the world has actually been dominated and democracy has been captured by the radical left. And if you're on the right, you're now the victim of, you're sort of underneath the Orwellian jackboot and you have to fight back. And first of all, it's not true, but also it means that a lot of people are discovering this incredibly revolutionary extreme idiom of self-expression and demand for emancipation that actually was very common in fringe radical left circles for ages, and it's totally normal for years, and students have done it forever, to talk about smashing capitalists and tearing people down and killing the rich. And again, that's also quite horrible, aggressive, violent language. But it was so fringe, and it never had any prospect of seriously becoming the mainstream throughout the 70s and 80s and 90s when it was going on, that people kind of ignored it and thought, well, you sort of understand that these people are just talking like freakishly violently.
My eat the rich t-shirt does not mean I actually want to eat the rich.
Yeah. But what we have now is that level of metaphorical idiomatic aggression, but with wide open channels straight into the mainstream of politics, up to and including getting the sort of the memes and the tone getting expression in the House of Commons, in analog politics. And so it feels substantially more dangerous, because it is substantially more dangerous, because it's normalized and legitimized. But the actual violent idiom is not new. It's total, the gates that used to sort of hold it back from being part of mainstream discourse being blown apart, that is new.
The kind of the persecution complex, the you can't say anything these days idea, has been kind of revived or re-energized as the two-tier Kia thing. The idea that it's a Stuart Lee sketch come to life, isn't it? If you say you're English, they throw you in jail. The idea that policing is being more severe and harsher on essentially on white people, when pretty much every conceivable bit of data says precisely the opposite. And yet it has become a live issue for debate, and it's been laundered and legitimized by quite a lot of columnists and quite a lot of professional opinion havers. Do you think we're in a new world now where that stuff has kind of got a foothold in, quotes, legitimate media?
Up to a point, although I think you could actually turn that on its head and say that this is a real problem more for that bit of the mainstream right that is kidding itself that an awful lot of people out there are really receptive to this stuff. I mean, generally, the view that if you threaten to burn down a hotel full of asylum seekers or throw bricks or start fights with the police, that you should go to jail for that, and for quite a long time. That's a really mainstream view, yes. And people who vote Conservative believe that. So if you are in the position of, if you're sort of Boris Johnson, you think there's a column to be written showing a bit of ankle to the alt-right, saying, well, actually, this is preposterous, the man was just making a joke, and that is not a mainstream position. But because you have this very fertile, overheated, sort of glasshouse ecosystem of radical right politics, that it's not necessarily even a commercial enterprise. A lot of this stuff is funded by people who like having power or have other revenue streams. It means you can sustain the idea and sustain the Conservative Party in the belief that this is a really vibrant and dynamic intellectual world. And actually it's not, it's fringe stuff. And I don't think, if these are the talking points on GB News or on right-wing British Twitter and people convincing themselves that because it's massive in America, they suddenly got this huge audience and they're getting 1 million likes from Nevada, them convincing themselves that actually they get somewhere in politics. They're not. And actually, they would be well advised to be a bit more aware of the fact that actually this is not British. This is not the British mainstream at all.
Seth, that connection with the United States and with the kind of the global nature of social media is really interesting. There is it's a meme, a genuine meme in the sense of a replicating idea. The idea that they're jailing people for Facebook posts in Britain. They're jailing like a tiny number of people. I looked, there's maybe about 6 or 7, and it's very, very clear incitement, very, very clear directed incitement.
And very much I agree with what Rafael says about if you look at those cases of people saying, I am calling upon you to burn down a hotel which is filled with people who were alive inside at the time. I mean, that couldn't be more clear. There is an element of, Elon Musk willfully turning a blind eye to the content of this when he's echoing that himself directly. The UK has traditionally had a very strong tradition of a public domain that's seen as disinterested, and that applied just as much to the BBC as it did to commercial television like ITV. And for a variety of background reasons, those traditional institutions haven't been doing that job as well. And what has moved into the void with people getting their news, particularly younger people getting their news from social media like Twitter, older people getting their news from social media like YouTube, it looks authoritative. It feels authoritative. It has all the trappings of mainstream, as it was called, media, although actually it's more like what's known as the counter-establishment. But it's very much open to these very deeply politicized process. This isn't anything new. I mean, if you go back 200 years, you look at sort of latter part of the 18th century, early 19th century, people were getting all sorts of dodgy pamphlets the whole time, telling them all sorts of strange things. But you'd have to use your intuition to discuss this. And what we're being increasingly persuaded to do via these things is to drown out countering voices and be told this is the one true version of events. And by the way, it's a global conspiracy to tell you otherwise, so stop listening to anything else.
I knew it was going to be coffee houses in the end. It all goes back to bloody coffee houses. We should never have discovered coffee. Raf, you and I talked about this a couple of days ago before when we were putting the podcast together. The weird idea that somehow, because social media is a kind of high intensity but often low information world where people have kind of bumbled in and got very excited, there does seem to be this belief amongst a large number of British people that we somehow have a First Amendment here, where whatever you say is protected because they see so much from America and because people like Trust magnify it and describe any attempt to enforce legislation on speech here that we've had literally for decades and in some cases centuries as an infringement on free speech. They seem to somehow imagine that the American Constitution applies and that their rights are being infringed. Do we need to do a better job of explaining what free speech is here in this country? Do we need to tell the one about the fire in the burning theatre, in the crowded theatre, a bit more often?
Well, yeah, there's two different elements to this, aren't there? One is as you say, there is no one single pristine constitutional entitlement to free speech that can apply across different societies. Everyone will draw the boundary somewhere slightly differently. I mean, there's a reason why there's not hardcore pornography at 10 o'clock in the morning on BBC One. Everyone at some level intuitively recognizes that there are limits to what you can say, where context matters, audience matters, that if you have a platform, that comes with power, and with that power comes a certain amount of responsibility. That's actually not a controversial view. It's a view that also actually exists in American culture. And so the Elon Musk describing himself as a free speech absolutist, I mean, he doesn't mean that. What he means is, I like having power and money, and I want to deploy the channel I've got essentially as a weapon in a conflict to try and determine the direction of American politics. So actually, that's just a hypocrisy. He's not really making an interesting or meaningful philosophical point about free speech. But your observation that actually, although the American general, the norms of the US are definitely way over on the more libertarian end of the spectrum, and I think if you are very online in this country, you could reasonably think that would be the case here. And you see this very often actually with regard to contempt of court rules as well. It's not a free speech issue, but people just not realizing that there are certain things the law stops you from publishing, and you might want to be aware of that before you publish them. So I think, again, it comes back to one of these situations where Britain is a much more European country in all sorts of cultural and social norms than people who derive their political intuition from an Americanized right-wing discourse like to think. And in answer to your question, could we benefit with a bit more education on that? I think yes, but also ultimately, I think it comes down to just being a little bit more honest about the fact that you regulate all kinds of behaviors when they're dangerous. You have speed limits on motorways so that people don't drive 150 miles an hour. You have a left and the right side so that people aren't trying to drive down the same side of the road really fast. Some of this information space, we have to talk about regulating it because of the harm that can be done if it's polluting the discourse. And that's not actually seriously an infringement of free speech in many, many cases. And the free speech frame, I think, is actually very misleading often.
And on the point about regulation, I think it's important to look at why we actually bother to have debates in particular cases, because I'm all for genuine debates. But so often when we're told, well, we need to have a debate about this, it's very much a sort of show trial. It's something done for shock. It's done for attention. And do you need the same example of Tommy Robinson being interviewed for something just to stir up a controversy and just to have people condemning it, as opposed to saying, Tommy Robinson's not actually that interesting and doesn't have anything unexpected or pertinent to say. Why don't we ask some people who might shed some light on this?
Often the let's have a debate thing is just the fancied up version of just asking questions. Well, what I'm actually doing is holding out the same frequently discredited ideas just to degrade and wear down the consensus by force majeure, isn't it? Just in closing, I want to ask both of you this. When you saw the cases of these often kind of pathetic people going to jail for gobbing off on Facebook in ways that are incitement, but they're pathetic, cringe individuals. Did a little voice at the back of your head go, have I ever said anything crazy on Facebook that in a different context might not look great? I mean, I know, I'm pretty sure I've called for Boris Johnson to be fired into the sun at some point, and I don't really think that's ever going to happen. But, you put it in a slightly different light.
I'm actually quite shy on all of social media, I suppose partly because if there is a voice at the back of your head saying, think twice about it, maybe just hold off on hitting the send button and think about it in the morning.
Yeah.
That's not to say I probably haven't, and I'm sure, now listening to this, people will happily go through my Twitter timeline to see what they can find. No, I didn't feel much sympathy for these people because, this was really nasty, visceral stuff.
Yeah.
And there's a difference between saying, I don't like Boris Johnson and I have a few choice things to say about him, and actual calls for violence.
Yeah. Raf, anything?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think because I was trained as a journalist, that you do have a certain amount of legal training that has to go on, ideally do, and you're aware of what constitutes libel, what constitutes incitement, and that the platform is publishing. So I think there are certain guardrails there that I like to think my qualifications to do what I do for a living come into play. But that doesn't mean I haven't been sort of caught up in the rage and the fury. And there was definitely a turning point for me in that 2016, 2019 period where Brexit was really ferocious, and I was getting involved in a lot of arguments online with supporters of Jeremy Corbyn about issues around anti-Semitism. And there was definitely one point when I was really sounding off on Twitter, and I got a text message from a friend saying, who could see the interactions I was having, just said, step away from the keyboard. And that was salutary and important. And basically since from that moment onwards, I've realized actually you could easily, you're not adding anything. You're just feeding the rage. There's no merit to this for you or for anyone else.
The thing
a turning point.
The thing I keep trying to tell myself is, it doesn't matter if this person changes their mind or not. They're just one person. You telling them that they're a moron and they can fuck off, or you burying them under facts and statistics, they're still just one person. It doesn't really matter, so why bust a gut?
But as that well-known meme says, somebody on the internet is wrong.
There is pretty good evidence to just the final point on this to suggest that really doing nothing and just posting better, good information or having positive interactions is the thing that works. That even if you retweet to ridicule, rebuttal, fact check, all of that stuff, all it does is amplify the bad stuff. Any interaction with the sort of the troll is feeding the troll, and it is counterproductive. There's almost nothing you can do apart from mute, block, and post more positive things.